of my predecessors as an Irish revolutionist here in Queen's, Peter Hart, was once asked why a Canadian was interested in looking at the Irish Revolution. And he said he'd looked at a number of different areas, possible areas for his PhD, and what attracted him to Ireland was the fact that, as he said himself, it was one of the best sourced revolutions in terms of archival evidence. If that was true when he wrote it at the start of this century, then it's even truer now, because one of the beneficial side effects of the decade of centenaries, as we call the commemorative period of the 19-teens and early 20s in Ireland, has been the emphasis by the Southern Irish government on releasing even more archival records. And most of these have been in the general category of post-conflict compensation claims. And while these claims shed even more light on events during the period, I think they're equally, if not more valuable, as a commentary on the early years of the Irish Free State and reflect many policy dynamics and attitudes within independent Ireland towards veterans and towards others whose lives were affected by conflict during that period. For many years, the absence of archival evidence was cited as the reason for the paucity of research on women. And I'm going to embarrass one of the audience members here, Margaret Ward, by saying that this just underscores how good Margaret's book on unmanageable revolutionaries was. To have written that with the sources available then, when we look at Margaret's work, it stands up so well in light of how much more work we have now. So Margaret, thankfully, was one of those people who didn't let that, you can't do women because there's no archives out there, bother her. But it's been noticeable, if you look at work that's been published since the start of the present century, it's been noticeable how the proliferation of archives has produced an abundance of high quality work on women and more widely gender, not just women, but gender in the revolutionary years. Going back to Peter Hart, in an essay of his in that compendium of essays, The IRA War, he set out his agenda for the new Irish revolutionary history, as he called it. And one of the things he said was that we needed to start looking at gender in the revolution, and that this should amount to more than just writing women into the picture. And I think now that we have these sources, which even Peter Hart couldn't have known about at the time he was writing, now that we have those sources, that is one of the many new avenues of investigation that we can undertake in the coming years. So the purpose of this paper is to examine how the evidence contained in these various compensation collections can facilitate a wider analysis of gender during the revolution. So the main forms that's just a list of the main forms of compensation, from specific 1916 property compensation, another category is personal injury, property compensation during the Civil War. The British government provided compensation largely to Southern Loyalists through the mechanism of the Irish Grants Committee. The British government also looked after its own former Crown servants in Ireland, largely through the RIC Tribunal. And then, of course, there was the way in which the Free State government made recompense to those whose lives had been disrupted by their contribution to the campaign for Irish independence. I just put the list up there, but I'll mention the different forms at different times. I mentioned briefly the Property Losses Ireland Commission, which relates specifically to 1916 and was the result of lobbying of the government by Dublin businessmen because of the losses they had sustained in the Rising. Daithí O'Corrán has written more extensively about this in a recent issue of Irish Historical Studies. But I think this isn't something I've looked at in huge detail, but I think there's potential there for somebody to do a discrete examination of the claims from women. For example, the number of women who claimed for the loss of their jewellery when the various jewellery stores in Dublin were damaged or destroyed is quite interesting. But there's much more than that. For example, it's something like 80 women artists, including some of the top women artists of the time, Sarah Purser and Estella Solomons, who were the first of the three here. They were among several artists who claimed for the loss of their work when over 500 works of art which were on display in the annual exhibition of the Royal Hibernian Academy were lost when the Academy building on Lower Abbey Street was destroyed. The other lady on the far left there, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, about whom Margaret has written quite a bit, was also awarded £44 for the loss and damage to personal effects that were removed during a raid on her home in April 1916. So they're just vignettes of how this source could be explored if you want to look to tell more of the story of women at this time. One thing you'll notice there is the emphasis on property and restoring property. And that prioritisation of restoring property is probably most noticeable in the Irish Free States legislation, the 1923 Irish Free State Damage to Property Compensation Act. This was as much a damage limitation exercise as it was a damage compensation act. It was brought in by the Free State government to replace existing British legislation under Criminal and Malicious Injuries Acts. Had they kept the old British legislation, they would have to pay much higher rates of compensation to the people who suffered property loss. So one of the first aims of the Irish Free State was to reduce the overall bill faced by the Irish Exchequer for the compensation it would have to pay for damage during the Civil War. The records for these, for the Damage to Property Compensation Act, the first set of records, which are held in the National Archives in Dublin under the Finance Compensation Series 2 files, were released in 2015. And a second set, the Finance Compensation Series 4 files, which I think deal with the 1933 Amending Act, are due for release later this year, as I understand it. These were claims which had to be processed through the courts. So they can also, if you have the Finance Compensation Act for each county, you can also complement them if you can find the court records for that county as well. So an example here again, I'm drawing again on my own research on Longford. For example, here is on this side here is the claim made to the Free State under the Damage to Property Compensation Act of Diana Dopping Heppenstall from Longford for damage to trees, I think it was. And then I was able to find the Longford court books, so I can trace, she makes her claim, and then I can trace how the claim was processed through the courts if I can find the archives. And that's one thing about all these various claims. It's a bit of a jigsaw, and you find someone's claim in one place, you find the way it's processed in another case. You might find somebody claiming compensation from the Free State and the British government. So by looking through all these different sources of compensation, you can put together quite a full picture of the claimants and what they were claiming for. Now these claims really are limited enough in terms of the number of claims by women. So far I've looked at 70 individual claims from Longford, and only about 10% of those are from females, probably reflecting the fact that the majority of property owners, the majority of property would be held by men. But one category of women for which they are quite useful is as a source of information on Loyalist women, and Diana Dopping Heppenstall, as you probably guessed by her name, would fall generally into the category of Southern Unionist, Southern Loyalist. So I think these files are particularly useful for charting the experience of Protestant Loyalists generally, but also Protestant and Loyalist women. And as Peter said, one of the other areas I've been looking at is this overall question of the experience of Southern Protestants and trying to account for the decline of the number of Southern Protestants in what is now the 26 counties during the Revolutionary period. That debate tends to be looked at in very general terms. Sources like these allow us to look at it in much more focused terms and to look to see if the experience of female Protestants was different to that of male Protestants. So it's an example of where these sources can tell us about the experience of women, but they can also help us comment on wider historiographical trends like the Protestant demographics. And a good example of this, which I found in the Longford case study, which I'm looking at. I've missed one there. Actually, this is these are more court cases, and they relate to the 33 Act. And I just put this in because all the IRA seemed to do in this period was steal women's bicycles. Everyone here, Mary Mahon was from Longford, bicycle taken by the IRA. What did she get? Did she get any money? Not sure she got any money. Mary Russell had her bicycle taken and she got £7.17 and 6pence. And Ellen McFitty, that's actually a Church of Ireland name, she got, so actually the value of a bicycle seems to have been £7.17 and 6pence. So if somebody wants to write a little treatise on women cyclists in Longford during the Civil War, these sources could be quite useful. But going back more generally to these compensation files as a source for the experience of women Protestants, here's a very good example of the Neil family from Edgeworthstown, whose home was attacked by the IRA in 1921 towards the end of the Civil War, and they were among that 1/3 of southern Protestants who left the borders of what became the Free State between 1911 and 26, and they migrated to Northern Ireland. And again, this is a very good example of the jigsaw and finding a piece in one collection and adding it to a piece from another collection. These are two sisters, Mary Neal, who claimed through the Damage to Property Compensation Act from the Free State. Her sister Annie claimed to the British through the Irish Grants Committee. Now in the end, neither of them got any money, purely because what happened to them happened in 1921 before the truce, and both of these schemes related to post-truce actions. But again, it's a good illustration. Even though they didn't get any money, the very fact that their claims are there, we can find details on what they claim happened to them. And again, it's a very good example of not limiting yourself to one source and looking for evidence from a variety of these sources. And it also helps back it up. So I can look at Mary Neal's claim and see if it's any different from what Annie was saying at a different time. And sometimes you get the same people applying to different people and giving completely different accounts of what happened. So those are the Free State compensation claims for property. And you'll notice everything I've talked about so far relates to damage to property. And knowing how sacrosanct property is in Ireland, it's no surprise that the burden of compensation fell very much on restoring property. And to get a stark example of that is when you compare the amount of money the Irish Free State government spent on restoring property as opposed to personal injury to civilians. Between 1923 and 1939, the Irish Free State government paid out £12.5 million in compensation for property losses. By contrast, they paid just over £750,000 to civilians for personal injuries. So it gives you an idea that there was definitely a hierarchy of victims, and property was the biggest victim. Where personal injury compensation came in, basically during the War of Independence and the truce period, each government just decided, right, we'll pay our own supporters. Now, these files are only coming on stream. Last year, I was down in the National Archives last year, and they tend to have little folders with the new releases, and I was standing at the main table waiting for something, and I see this folder, and on the spine of it, it says Department of Justice Personal Injury Compensation Files 1920 to 22, and I go, not knowing that this existed, and I look at it, and it's a file of over 2,000 claims made to the Irish, or processed by the Irish Department of Justice for various personal injuries during the War of Independence and Civil War. Now, these files are slightly limited because they only contain the claims. The accounts are brief. Often they're only one page, setting out the name of the claimant, the date on which the alleged incident happened, and brief details of the alleged incident. So you could be claiming anything, and there's no further, there's nothing else in the file to indicate the process, whether or not these claims were investigated and upheld, or whether people were paid. So all we have is the claim of what people say happened to them. But nevertheless, they are quite a good source. For example, Bridget Farley from Longford claimed that the Crown forces shot fired shots through the door and windows and smashed in the door, took myself, daughter and 2 sons out of our beds, beat us with butt of rifles, put my 2 sons on their knees and fired shots over them, took them to Granard and beat them several times to make them tell where my son and also his flying column was. That's fairly believable, and again, her sons were IRA men, so it's not hard to imagine that's a likely scenario, because we know that that's the sort of activities and the sort of behaviour you could come to expect from the Crown Forces in seeking out IRA men. Some claims were also submitted by family members. For example, Jeremiah O'Sullivan here claimed on behalf of his daughter, who fainted after the Crown Forces behaved in a very violent manner towards her in a raid on their home in February 1921, as a result of which she is now unable to leave her bed without help. Now, this is one of the problematic ones, because in the absence of any remaining documentation showing how that claim was assessed and what, if any, compensation was allowed, you have to treat some of the details in that file with caution. If you could imagine an investigator looking at that claim and really wondering whether Ellen O'Sullivan was still able to leave her bed unaided in 1924, 3 years after the raid described. Now, maybe she was, but it's possible it's an exaggeration, but in the absence of any corroborating evidence, either way, we don't know. Now, I do understand that related files said to be held by the Department of Finance, which I hope will come on stream in the next few years, might throw more light on the adjudication process and help us to establish the veracity of these claims. But for the moment, all we have to go on is what the people claimed themselves. Now, these are all fairly new files. They've all come on stream. We're only starting to get a glimpse of them, and you can, I hope what I've said already indicates the potential contained therein to look at the women's experience of the revolution. But there are files which have been available for a long time, and they haven't been looked at properly. One of the best sources of evidence for personal injury compensation has been available since 1980, but its potential as a source for studying gender in the revolution has not been adequately realised. And this is the Irish Grants Committee, the British government's principal scheme for compensating Southern Loyalists for loss. And they took a much broader interpretation. It could be economic loss, it could be personal injury, it could be damage to property, or whatever. But it was post-truce, so it had to be something which happened either during the truce or the Civil War. People who have looked at the Irish Grants Committee so far have looked at it almost exclusively from the perspective of Protestants and Southern Loyalists. R.B. McDowell, Niamh Brennan, Brian Hughes, Paul Taylor has looked at the experience of ex-soldiers. There has been some of the gender potential has been explored by Gemma Clark in her book on everyday violence in the Civil War, and also by Mo Moulton. But the full potential of the Irish Grants Committee to contribute to a gender analysis of the revolution has yet clearly to be realised. And as I said, this source has been, these files were opened in 1980, so it's a good example of how women have been hiding in plain sight in the archives for many years. And I think also one of the rich areas of study in these files relate to the nature of violence perpetrated against and experienced by women. And in this regard, the Irish Grants Committee contains some of the best details of one of the most notorious cases of rape during the entire period of the Irish Revolution, for which a written record exists. And it relates to, it's a fairly well-known case, so some of you will be familiar with it. I'll go back to that other slide in a minute just to explain what it was. But this is the case of the rape of a woman, a married Protestant in Tipperary called Mrs. Biggs, who was outraged altogether on 8 or 9 different occasions when her family home was raided by about a dozen armed men who said that they were in the IRA, and the names of the men who appeared in court would indicate that they were anti-treaty Republicans, on the night of June the 16th, 1922. Her husband was attacked physically, and while the assault upon his wife was in progress, he was kept fully informed by these raiders of what they were doing. Now, the euphemism of outrage is used in most of the first-hand accounts in Mrs. Biggs's case, though in one of the reports the word rape is used, and when the charges were brought in court against 4 of her assailants, the charge was that they did rape the said Mrs. Biggs. And this also appears to be the case referred to in the final report of the Irish Grants Committee, where it was noted that, quote, there was one case of gang rape. So it's a very useful source for answering this question of the nature and extent of sexual violence during the Revolution. But it's also offers huge potential for looking at the emotional impact of the assault on Mrs. Biggs. And rereading the file again in her own words, I was particularly taken by a line at the end of it, which I think this dates from about 1926. "We cannot hold up our heads amongst our family and acquaintances. My sister, Mrs. Peacock, has since died from shock as a result of the incident, and the stigma to the family." Now, just yesterday, because we academics don't work on weekends, I was looking at trying to find out who Mrs. Peacock was, and I went online to I was looking through the National Archives wills, and also on the Irish genealogy website, which is deaths, marriages and births, and I did come across a suicide of a Mrs. Peacock in 1924. Now, whether it's the same lady, I don't know, but I need to do a bit more looking into it. If it was her, then this case could be even more tragic than it looks at first sight. But I think that sentence that we cannot hold up our heads because of the stigma to the family, that emotional sense of shame that she felt because she was raped, not because of something she did, but something that was done to her. I think there's huge potential here for exploring the history of emotions, something that's obviously becoming a very popular trend in history, but not something that we as Irish revolutionary historians have only started to dabble around the edges of. So this case of Mrs. Biggs raises all sorts of questions on the gendered nature of violence. I mean, why did these men rape her? It's often cited again. It's often used in the argument about the way in which Protestants were treated. What was it for them? Was it her gender? Was it her religion? Why did they not just beat them up? Why did they perpetrate that type of violence? So it says something about the woman and the violence she experienced. It's a classic case of looking at the revolution from a gender perspective, because it asks all those questions about why male perpetrators of violence perpetrate certain forms of violence and not others. So there's a few other cases. While the final report of the Irish Grants Committee only mentioned this one case of gang rape, there are a few other incidents in the Irish Grants Committee which suggest that there were sexual assaults. For example, William McKenna stated that he did not believe his 75-year-old wife would ever, quote, recover from the outrage committed on her. Now, outrage, it does tend to be the euphemism for rape, so possibly, we can't say for definite, but possibly you're talking about another case of rape there, but it just was never given that name. One file I missed, I just skipped, slide I missed here. I'm talking a lot about the files for the Civil War, and the Truce and Civil War are probably the best ones. The personal injury claims for the War of Independence are slightly harder to get. What the British have on their side are these large ledgers, and I know this isn't very visible because it's a photograph of one, but this is the list of compensation that the British paid to civilians in Longford. And I'll just point out one there at the top, Kate Kelly, the first name is there, barrack servant. She claimed £500 and she was given 75. Now there's no evidence, nothing there to say who she was, what happened to her, why she got the money, but from a report in the Longford Leader, I know that she was one of those unfortunate women who had her hair cut off by the IRA for working for the Crown Forces. One of the most common forms of violence against women, and if you're watching Resistance and RTE, you'll have seen a dramatisation of it. It's also dramatised well in Ken Loach's The Wind That Shakes the Barley. But I happen to, from having seen a previous report, I know what happened to her. Now, why she got £75, again, we're not clear. Was it just for the trauma of having her hair cut off? Or as a barrack servant, once that happened to her, it might be reasonable to assume that she didn't go back to that job again, so possibly the compensation was for loss of employment as well. Other evidence of, going back to the Irish Grants Committee, other evidence of the female experience of revolution, there's a lot of claims for economic boycotting. Again, this is seems to be quite common coming from single Protestant female farmers and businesswomen. Some women claimed for the murders of their husbands, like Margaret Robertson Moore's husband was steward to Henry Guinness, and he was shot dead by the IRA at the Guinness estate in October 1922. But Henry Guinness, his employer, was a member of the Irish Free State Senate, so this was part of the IRA's campaign against the property of senators. You get a lot of claims in the Irish Grants Committee from ex-RIC and their families. Bessie Churchill was a primary school teacher in Kings County, or I'd better say Offaly, and she was forced to leave her job because her husband had to leave the country. Well, first of all, she was boycotted. Her school was boycotted because her husband was in the RIC, and then they had to leave. Ellen Wilkinson likewise was a primary school teacher, and her husband had to leave the RIC. He joined the RUC. She lost her job as well. Now, RIC families also had access to disturbance and removal allowances from the RIC tribunal. So while there's some evidence of that in the Irish Grants Committee, you're more likely to find that in the RIC tribunal. Business people, including a lot of business women, claimed for losses due to custom arising from boycotts and the departure of the RIC. These appear to have evinced some sympathy from the Irish Grants Committee, but there was one part of Ireland where these claims were not tolerated by the Irish Grants Committee, and that was Ennistimon in County Clare. Agnes O'Halloran claimed that she hadn't got a day's work since the British forces left because she, like Kate Kelly, had been a barrack servant, and once the RIC became persona non grata, people wouldn't hire her, and then the only people she was working for, the RIC, they left, so she had no money. Likewise, Mary O'Brien from Ennistimon also had worked for 13 years doing laundry and scrubbing from the RIC in Ennistimon. Now, Ennistimon's a fairly small part of the world, and not surprisingly, when the Irish Grants Committee started getting all of these claims from Ennistimon, I mean, the RIC must have been some of the best looked after police forces in the country if they had this army of women going around doing all their domestic duties for them. So they sent an investigator around, and this investigator came to the conclusion that many poor people felt that any good yarn was good enough if there was money to be got from England. So I think that's a County Clare version of filling up your boots 1920s style. But certainly there was a bit of, shall we say, they were a little bit dubious of all these claims. Having said that, you might think with compensation files, people are going to look for all sorts of money. If anything, probably a lot of these cases were assessed quite stringently. And even the Irish Grants Committee themselves say that they don't think there was a huge amount of fraud involved. So I've been looking very much at, I've looked at property compensation, I've looked at personal injury compensation to civilians. The last category I want to look at is compensation for combatants, people who were actually involved in the conflict. I've mentioned the Crown Forces already. The British government accounted for the disbanded RIC. The British police in Ireland, the Royal Irish Constabulary, were disbanded in 1922. So those policemen who had stayed in the force and stayed loyal were compensated for the loss of their jobs by the British government. They included the Black and Tans. The British government were not going to ask the Irish government to take up the bill for compensating the Black and Tans. Now, I haven't looked in great detail yet at the RIC tribunal. But there's another group of RIC, of Royal Irish Constabulary policemen, who didn't stay in the force until 1922, and at the urging of Sinn Féin and the IRA, either resigned from or were dismissed from the RIC because of their sympathy with the nationalist campaign. Once the British government had been very generous to the disbanded RIC, the Irish Free State government could not be seen to be any less generous to those, if you like, loyal nationalist RIC who had left the force or been kicked out of it because of their sympathies with the Republican movement. So the Irish government compensated those resigned and dismissed RIC men reasonably well in terms of giving them additional pension years. Legislation was passed specifically for that in 1923. Now, the gender potential of these schemes is probably somewhat limited because most of the RIC were policemen in terms of evidence for RIC wives. The RIC tribunal possibly is stronger on that, but it's a source I haven't yet had much time to look at. So the British government had treated its police well. The Irish Free State government had to match that by treating the resigned and dismissed RIC well. So if the police had been treated that well, then the Irish Free State government equally had to treat very well its own veterans. So those ex-combatants of the IRA and the Irish volunteers who had fought for Irish independence had to be treated well too. And the first group to be compensated by the Irish government were those who were wounded or killed during the Civil War or during the Revolution. And they were compensated under the 1923 Army Pensions Act. A companion pension scheme was introduced the following year in 1924, which introduced a very unique form of pensions based purely on service, which I've written elsewhere I think was purely a political move designed to damp down opposition within the Free State ranks after the Army Mutiny and to deal with the threat posed to the stability of the state by former combatants. But before I go on to that, I want to talk a bit about the Army Pensions Act, because most of the compensation here was given, some of it was given to men themselves who were injured, but quite a bit of it was given to the dependents of men who were killed. So in that case, it's a very useful source for gender. For example, there's a pension given to Roger Casement's sister, who Casement had been supporting his sister from the time of her divorce in the 19-teens, and once he died, she lost her entire means of support. So the government passed a pension for her. But I think a very telling case of attitudes to gender comes in the case of the family of Patrick Perry. Patrick Perry was a Free State soldier who was killed in the early days of the Civil War. And almost immediately after his death, a competition for who would get the compensation started between his mother and the lady described in the file as his unmarried wife. This woman with whom Perry had been living and with whom she had two children, had previously been married, and her first husband had gone off to join the British forces in the war and was never heard of again. So she applied for the pension. Perry's mother applied for the pension, saying that this woman, that Rose Perry, the unmarried wife, wasn't entitled to it because basically she was a bigamist. And when it came down to it, the way in which the legislation was drafted was said that there was nothing in it which could authorise the admission of a claim on behalf of the woman who lived with Perry, nor was there anything in the legislation to provide payment to his two illegitimate children. Now, the file is heartbreaking at times, but it's quite revealing about attitudes to gender and sexual morality. It's clear that civil servants in the Department of Defence were sympathetic, and they made the point that the British Army tended to look at the term children in the natural rather than the legitimate sense, and maybe the Irish could do that. Well, of course, the decision in the end lay with Ernest Blythe, who was the Irish Minister for Finance, and Ernest Blythe was not going to give away his money freely. So in the end, you won't be surprised to hear, he applied a very strict interpretation, and the Perry children, Rose Perry didn't get any money, the children didn't get any money, Granny made off with the pension. And there's another quite telling phrase in the file. One of the civil servants says this decision was a cruel one on the face of it, as there seems no good reason why helpless children should suffer for their parents' error. Well, the poor helpless children did suffer because they ended up in the orphanage in Eccles Street. What became of them after that, I'm not sure, but it's one of those ones where you want to have Ernest Blythe in front of you and you want to actually strangle him slowly and painfully. That's just an example of some of what you find in the Army Pensions Act. The military service pensions then, which is probably the collection I have done most work on, the very reason for introducing these pensions highlights a very gendered approach to what I would call conflict transformation or conflict resolution after the Irish Revolution. And I work very much here from the basis that Ireland in 1922 is what we would now call a post-conflict society. The introduction of these are purely service pensions. You get them just for what you did. They were brought in, as I say, to damp down opposition within the Free State ranks. That's my view of it anyway. But they're based on the whole presumption that men with guns are potentially violent and inherently given to violence. And you enter into a bond of good behaviour. Basically, we'll give you a pension and you stay quiet and you keep your guns locked away. And that's still a very common idea reflected in many post-conflict scenarios. And I think it explains the effective exclusion of women from the initial pension process for 10 years between 1924 and 1934. In spite of Coleman and Monn's role in the revolution, they were excluded initially from the Pension Acts passed in 1924. These were limited to veterans of 1916-21 and also those who had served in the Irish Free State Army during the Civil War. The only person who could have served in the Irish Free State Army during the Civil War was a man, or so they thought. That appeared effectively to exclude women who were not allowed into the army. But as always in Ireland, there has to be one exception. And the exception in this case was Dr. Bridget Lyons, a 1916 veteran who had a brief commission in the army at the start of the Civil War. Before the army was put on a firm legislative basis in 1923, she was given it appears to be a personal commission by Collins. The reason she was given it was she was a doctor and they needed a female doctor to help deal with the number of hunger-striking female Republicans during the Civil War. Even still, the army sought to exclude her from pension eligibility, and I think they would have succeeded in doing so had she not had Common and Wale, high connections in the old Sinn Féin movement and Common and Wale. You'll see her here, the lady in the glasses, and look who she's sitting next to, the President of the Executive Council of the Irish Free State, W.T. Cosgrave. So as soon as she brought her case to Cosgrave's attention, her pension followed fairly soon after that. It probably also helped that she was a niece of one of the first revolutionary Sinn Féiners elected a TD, Joe McGuinness, and another uncle, Frank McGuinness, was a TD or a senator for W.T. Cosgrave's party. So I firmly believe it was her that the army would quite happily have not given her a pension, but she had the right political connections. The effort to exclude her from the pension was based on a precedent set in the case of the army pension not given to Margaret Skinner. Margaret Skinner was badly wounded during the rising in which she participated as a member of Connolly's Irish Citizen Army. Her request for a disability pension was refused on the grounds that the term soldier in the legislation applied only to men. Now, my sense is that the real reason for her refusal is in this addendum to a letter by Hugo MacNeill, the Army Adjutant General, in which he just happened to mention, I would add for your information that applicant has been a prominent irregular since 1922. Irregular meaning anti-treaty IRA, opposed to the state, took up arms against the state during the Civil War. Common and Wale were damned if they were given money to the anti-treaty IRA. I'm not saying gender isn't significant in this case. What I think the real significance of gender in her case is that her sex, rather than her political stance, was deemed as a more acceptable excuse for refusing her pension. They weren't going to turn around and say publicly, oh, we're not giving you a pension because you're a Republican. But it's more acceptable to say, no, we're not giving you a pension because a woman couldn't be a soldier. Now, eventually the legislation was amended and women were admitted to full pension eligibility in the 1930s. And I think pensioning itself then reveals a lot about how women veterans were treated. Women were still only admitted on sufferance. There's 5 grades of eligibility of levels of service. From 1934 onwards, it's A to E in descending order, and women were only given the 2 bottom ones, grades D and E, the same as Fianna Éireann, the youth wing of the revolutionary movement. So in some ways it's infantilizing women. The women and the children can only get the 2 lowest forms of pension. And we see this as well. We see this attitude very strongly held by the men responsible for enacting the legislation and implementing it. The Fianna Fáil Minister for Defence, Frank Aiken, who really had to be almost forced into including women at the last minute in an amendment in the Senate in the 1934 legislation, wanted to point out that the same test of service will be applied to women as to men. And the result will, in my opinion, be very few being granted an active service certificate. While members of Common are treated equally with men, they will not be treated better because their responsibility were not as great. So women didn't do nearly as much as the men during the War of Independence. Aiken's great close comrade from their days with the 4th Northern Division, John McCoy, was one of the principal assessors for pensions, and he likewise, setting out the process by which women's pensions would be assessed, stated that it would be unwise to adopt a service of standard for women less exacting than what would be applied to men. The service recognised should be of a military nature. Activities, in other words the ones the women did, such as collecting and distributing funds, propaganda classes, cannot be seriously considered without other activities of a similar nature. Now, basically what you're looking at here is that women were judged not by their own standards, but by the standards of the male volunteers, so they could never meet that standard. The result, not surprisingly, was that women felt, with a lot of justification, that it was much harder for them to convince the assessors of the merits of their pension claims. I just want to mention one or two very quick other points about the pensions. These files have been available for about 5 years now, but more of them keep being released. And the more they are released, the more you realise just how much potential is here. And in the case of Harriet Biggs, I mentioned the potential for using compensation files to start looking at the revolution from the perspective of emotions. And this really jumped out at me looking at one of the compensation claims from one of the IRA men who was involved in the Alton-O'Vea massacre in Armagh in June 1922. James Marin later wrote that I had to go home, and for a long time I could not sleep thinking of the woman and the others we shot. I got the nerve paralysis in my face shortly after that. Clearly he's been haunted by shooting people, but I'm just interested by the woman and the others. He specifically mentions the woman. So that you get a sense of remorse coming out of these pension files, and that's a whole other area of Irish revolutionary study that we haven't looked at. Another area, again, with gender potential relates to post-traumatic stress disorder, or what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, because the Army Pensions Acts initially were only for disabilities, for physical disabilities, for wounds, but they were expanded in the 1920s to cover illness. So you get a lot of claims here from men and women claiming traumatic impact. And this is where these are a unique source, because yes, there's lots of PTSD pension claims for soldiers after the First World War, but they're all for men. What we have here is a collection of medical files which can show us the impact of conflict on a fairly large cohort of women. So I think that could be quite unique in that regard. And one thing that just struck me, and I don't know if this is a thing or not, or maybe I'm reading too much into it, but what struck me is the language of diagnosis that's used. And I think this file from Kate Greeny was interesting. She was diagnosed with neurasthenia. Everybody had neurasthenia, or general neurosis. But there's also a claim that this lady is generally neurotic. So something that I think that could prove quite enlightening would be to take the language of diagnosis used in the trauma applications from men and those from women to see if there's a different gender diagnosis, to see if hysteria or neurosis really was a female malady in the views of the doctors assessing these things. So I'll try and draw these observations to some sort of a conclusion. I think these newly released and indeed forthcoming archival releases offer enormous potential for a gender analysis of the revolution, both during and especially after the conflict. Not just for putting women into the picture, but for a truly gendered analysis, for also looking at the differences, the different impact of conflict on men and women. Existing files, though, also have to be looked at. As I said with regard to the Irish Grants Committee, the women have been hiding there the whole time and nobody has noticed them. So we need to go back to long open files and go back and look at them from a gender perspective. So what can they tell us? Just to throw out a few ideas of what I think they can tell us, apart from the basics of what the experience of women and men were, I think they show us a lot about the gendered assumptions underlying conflict transformation and resolution in the early post-conflict Irish Free State. I think they allow us to take a more gendered perspective to look at other established questions, such as the experience of Southern Protestants. And I think they open up entirely new areas of investigation to start examining the Irish Revolution from the conflict of from the perspective of emotions, and also from this perspective of post-conflict trauma and how it affected men and women differently.